Picture a stretch of cold gray coast, 11 miles past the last paved road, where the spruce runs straight down to the water and the wind never fully stops. Now find the one thing that doesn't belong. A tower, granite, 5 stories of cut stone climbing straight into the sky on an empty point, narrowing as it rises, a ring of stone railing crowning the very top. Too tall for a house, too lonely for anything else. Inside, a girl kneels at a hearth wide enough to walk into. 17 years old, $300 to her name, a dead woman's ring on her right hand. Her fingers find the edge of one massive floor stone, and it moves. Not a crack, not settling, a gap left on purpose by someone who wanted it lifted. Headlights swing up the lane behind her, a lane no car should know. She doesn't turn around. She presses down on the stone. The morning Sadie Vance turned 17, she came downstairs and found her whole life packed into a suitcase by the front door. Not her mother standing there to explain it, not her father, just the suitcase. Brown leather cracked at the corners, her grandmother's once, sitting on the hardwood like a sentence already passed. A white envelope was tucked under the handle. $300 inside. And a note. Her mother's handwriting, looping and careful, the way you write when you've practiced the words a dozen times and still don't believe a single one of them. We love you, Sadie, but we can't keep watching you throw your future away. When you're ready to be serious, you know where we are. She read it once, then again. Then she folded it along its own crease and slid it back into the envelope and set the envelope on the little table by the door, where the keys lived, where the mail piled up, right beside the chipped ceramic bowl shaped like a rooster that her grandmother had carried home from somewhere 30 years ago and that nobody in this house had ever once used. The kitchen was quiet behind her, no coffee on, no radio, a house holding its breath so it wouldn't have to look at her. She almost called out, almost, except what would she even say? Happy birthday to me. Thanks for the cash. Tell Dad the saw still pulls a little left. No. She picked up the suitcase, and she did not look back. Her aunt was waiting in the living room doorway. Sandra Keel, cream blazer, low heels, a coffee mug held in both hands the way a person holds a mug when they want very badly to look relaxed and are the opposite of it. Sandra was her father's younger sister, 52 years old. She sold houses for a living, the big glassy ones, the ones with kitchen islands the size of small boats, out of an office downtown with her own smiling face up on the bus stop ads. She had strong opinions about Sadie. Most of them were about waste, about potential, about what a girl could become if she'd only quit. Quit what exactly never did get said out loud. It was Sandra who'd suggested the note, instead of a conversation. Sadie understood that without being told. Because a conversation has a face in it, a note doesn't. This isn't punishment, sweetheart. Sandra's voice was warm, calibrated, the voice she used on a buyer who was halfway out the door. It's a push. Sadie said nothing. She carried the suitcase past her aunt and out onto the porch and into the thin gold light of the morning. There was the maple her father planted when she was 4. The driveway where he'd stood behind her at 9 and folded his hands over hers on a circular saw, the two of them squinting through a spray of sawdust while he taught her where the blade wanted to wander. The side yard where her grandmother Cleo used to sit with her on Saturdays, a bucket of fieldstone between their knees, teaching her to read each piece by weight and by grain. Good stone sits different in your palm than pretty stone, Cleo always said. You'll feel it before you ever see it. Cleo had been gone 4 years now, and the man who taught her the saw, her father, he didn't do that kind of work anymore. Hadn't in a long while. Not since Sandra had sat him down and explained kindly the way she explained everything that working with your hands was something a successful man simply paid other people to do. Sadie stood at the end of the driveway. She counted to 10. Then she walked toward the bus station with $300, a dead woman's suitcase, and a ring on her right hand. The ring had been her grandmother's, a plain band of yellow gold, one small oval stone set into it the color of the sea in winter somewhere between green and gray and blue, depending who was asking and what the light happened to be doing. Cleo had pressed it into her palm 2 days before she died, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic in the lavender she kept in her cardigan pockets. Sadie was 13, holding her grandmother's hand, trying not to cry and failing at it. "This ring came from a place that's waiting for you," Cleo had whispered. So quiet, Sadie had to lean in. "You'll know it when you see the stone." Sadie had worn it every day since. She touched it when she was scared. She touched it now. The bus station smelled like floor wax and stale coffee and the loneliness of every place where people are always arriving and departing and never quite staying. She bought a ticket as far north as her money felt comfortable going. She found a bunk in a hostel, $32 a night, 6 beds to a room, and she paid for 3 nights and sat on the thin mattress and pulled out the notebook she kept in the outer pocket of her grandmother's bag. She made a list. Not a list about feelings. Sadie had never been one for feelings on paper. Feelings she kept where she kept the ring, close and quiet. This list was practical. What she had, what she needed, what she could do. Have. $204. The clothes in the suitcase. The leather bag. A phone with a spider web screen and 2 months left before the plan her parents paid for went dark. Lime mortar, slate, load-bearing walls, hands that knew the difference. Need, a roof that cost less than $32 a night, a way to earn, a direction. Do, stone, carpentry, restoration. The work she'd built into her bones across 100 Saturdays before anybody convinced anybody it was beneath them. She looked at the list a long time. Then she opened the cracked phone and started to search. Cheap apartments, nothing under $800 a month. Rural cottages, priced like she had a spare decade tucked in her back pocket. Restoration programs, a handful of them all wanting a credit history she did not have. Because 17-year-olds don't have credit histories. They have report cards and opinions, and that's about the whole inventory. And then on the second night in the buzzing fluorescent quiet of the hostel common room, a vending machine coffee going cold in her hand, she typed something different. Abandoned property for sale, Maine, $1. Because when you've got $200 and no plan, the word free starts to look an awful lot like a door. It was real. A county program up the Maine coast. Senate County. A coastal restoration initiative, properties the county had held for decades handed off for almost nothing to anyone willing to fix them up and live in them. 12 years it had been running. Most of the listings already claimed. 3 were left, and the third one had a name instead of an address. Quill's Folly. Sadie read the listing 4 times. A stone tower, built 1887. 5 stories of cut granite on a promontory called Gaunt Point in the village of Graywick, 11 miles past Rockland, where the road finally gives up and the bay takes over. Slate roof, a central hearth. Last occupied 1957. Held in county receivership since the death of the last known heir. Asking price, $1. Conditions. The buyer commits to residency or active restoration within 24 months. Registers as a resident of the county. Preserves the original stone. $1. Then she looked at the photographs, and she forgot how to breathe. The first photo was taken from the foot of the point looking up, and rising out of the rock, out of the spruce and the cold gray Atlantic light, was the strangest, tallest, loneliest thing she had ever seen pretending to be a building. A tower, granite, 5 floors stacked straight into the sky, each stone cut square and fitted to the next so tightly you couldn't have slid a knife between them. The walls narrowed as they climbed the way a lighthouse narrows, tapering toward a steep cone of black slate at the very top. And ringing that cone just below the peak, a stone gallery, a walkway, a granite railing running the whole way around like the parapet of a castle that had wandered too far north and gotten lost. It didn't belong to the village beneath it. It didn't belong to the century. It stood on that point the way a held breath stands in a throat alone, deliberate, refusing to let go. Somebody 140 years ago had built a private lighthouse on the coast of Maine, and the listing called it a folly. The second photo was the inside. A wide shot of the ground floor, flagstone underfoot, heavy timber overhead, and along one whole curved wall a hearth so enormous that three grown men could have stood inside it shoulder to shoulder. But it was the stone Sadie couldn't pull her eyes off of. The granite of those walls, gray, green, blue, the color of the sea in winter, the color of the stone in the ring on her right hand. Not exactly, nothing is ever exactly anything, but close. Close enough that something shifted in her chest the way a number shifts when a load calculation finally comes out clean and the whole structure you've been staring at for an hour suddenly makes sense. Cleo had grown up somewhere in Maine. She'd said so, rarely, always briefly, always in the same breath as stone, how granite behaves, how the coast changes the way you read the weather. Sadie had never thought to ask where exactly, and by the time she was old enough to want the where, Cleo was already gone. She touched the ring. You'll know it when you see the stone. She booked a bus to Rockland. She was in her seat 40 minutes early. She wrote for the first 2 hours. Not about her parents, not about the note. She wrote what she always wrote when her chest got loud and crowded structural observations. How granite takes a freeze-thaw cycle. What lime mortar needs to stay flexible instead of brittle. How you read a slate roof from the ground before you ever trust it with your weight. The things her father taught her back when her father still taught her things. The Maine coast arrived somewhere north of Portland. It arrived the way it always arrives to a person seeing it new, all at once, completely, until everything that came before it looks like a rough draft. Rock headlands over cold gray water, spruce running straight down to the tide line, stone walls crossing fields that men cleared by hand 150 years ago, and then walked away from left to weather into something that looked a great deal like dignity. Sadie pressed her palm flat against the window glass and kept it there a long time. Rockland at noon. A county bus the rest of the way north along the coast, stopping at villages that got smaller every time the road got narrower. The driver told her Graywick was the last stop. He said it the way people say a thing when they want you to understand something they're too polite to come right out with. Graywick wasn't much. A white clapboard store with a hand-painted sign, a post office the size of a tool shed, a small white church up on a rise, a cemetery behind it, running right up to the spruce, a few houses, a working wharf at the end of a gravel lane, and the smell of salt and bait riding in on the wind off the water. The county office was a low brick building beside the church. The door was unlocked. Inside, a woman somewhere past 60 sat behind a desk fortified with file folders, working a computer that looked like it remembered the last century fondly. Her nameplate said, Bess Trundy County Clerk. She looked up. She looked at the suitcase. She looked at Sadie. And then she set her pen down with the slow finality of a woman who has watched a great many hopeful people walk through that exact door. You're here about Quill's Folly. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. You came a long way to freeze. I came a long way to work. Bess studied her, a long beat. The look of a woman taking inventory. You know what that place is? A granite tower, 1887, slate roof, hearth on the ground floor. You know what condition it's in. I saw the photos. Photos lie. Stone doesn't. Something moved at the corner of Bess Trundy's mouth. Not a smile, adjacent to one. Roof's bad near the top, she said. No power past this church. The well wants testing before you drink a drop of it. And the nearest anything is the 11 miles you just rode. I can work with all of that. You got restoration in you. My father's a contractor. I've been on his site since I was 9. Bess looked down at Sadie's hands, and Sadie let her. Because Sadie's hands told the truth, her face was too tired to bother with. Old calluses at the base of the fingers, a thin white scar across the left palm where a chisel slipped when she was 11, and her grandmother wrapped it in a dish towel and told her not to cry. And she didn't. All right, Bess said. She pulled a folder from the bottom of a stack without looking the way you reach for something in your own dark kitchen, knowing exactly where it lives. Let's do the paperwork. 3 pages. Sadie signed where the little penciled X marks waited for her. She paid $1. From the envelope her mother left her. She set the bill on the desk and slid it across, and it sat there between them, a single dollar, looking like exactly what it was, and nothing at all like what it was about to buy. Bess stamped it. Bess copied it. Bess handed back a receipt and a map drawn by hand on a half sheet of copier paper. Lane's not maintained, she said. You walk it, 1.75 miles. You'll see the tower before you see anything else. She paused. You won't be able to miss it. Nobody ever has. That was rather the whole point of the thing. Thank you. You got somewhere to sleep if she won't have you tonight. I'll figure it out. Bess opened a drawer, wrote on a card, held it out. Orpha Tibbets rents a room on the main road. Clean, fair. Won't ask you a single question, which up here is the highest compliment there is. Sadie took the card. You're not the first to come up that lane with a suitcase and an idea, Bess said. Most of them come in summer, when it looks easy. A pause. It's never easy. I know. She walked north out of the village until she found the lane, a granite gatepost with no gate. The iron hinges still mounted in the stone rusted the color of old blood. The track beyond it overgrown but passable grass standing tall down the center where no tire had run in years. Spruce saplings creeping in from both sides, the slow, patient way spruce creeps in on everything people stop minding. A stone wall ran along the east side of the lane, settled, mossed, still holding its limestone on stone, the way good dry work holds long after the hands that stacked it are gone. Sadie walked. The suitcase pulled at her arm. The light went long and gold the way it goes on the Maine coast in early July. The light that makes everything look like it has always been there and intends to stay. She saw the top of it first. Above the tree line, before the body of the tower had cleared the spruce, a cone of black slate, and beneath it that ring of pale granite, the gallery, the parapet, the walkway in the sky catching the last of the sun and holding it like it was holding a secret. Then the lane curved, and the tower stood up out of the rock in front of her. Whole, enormous, impossible. She stopped walking. Because no, that wasn't a house, was a house. A house was 4 walls and a roof, and this was 5 stories of granite rising off the spine of Gaunt Point like something the earth itself had decided to grow. The base wide, the walls 2 feet thick or more cut stone, fitted to cut stone in courses so clean they looked poured instead of laid. Narrowing as it climbed, deep-set window slits marching up the curve at intervals, each floor a little smaller than the one below it. The slate cone at the crown, the stone gallery beneath where a person could stand and see the whole bay, the whole coast, the whole gray reach of the open water. And straight up the center of it, embedded in the wall, climbing every single floor from the ground to the cap a chimney. One column of granite thick as a man threading the whole tower together like a spine. Behind it, far out past the rocks, the bay went on forever. Flat, cold, silver. Sadie set the suitcase down in the long grass, and she just looked. Because nobody builds this. Nobody builds a 5-story stone tower on an empty point 11 miles past the last paved road and calls it a home. You build a thing like this for one reason and one reason only. You build it so it can be seen. Somebody had wanted to be seen from out on that water, badly enough to spend years stacking granite into the sky. And the whole village for 140 years had decided he was a fool for it. Quill's folly. She picked up the suitcase, and she walked the rest of the way to the door. The door was oak, black with age and salt, hung on iron straps gone deep orange-brown. It had settled open just slightly the way a door settles when nobody has closed it properly in a very long time. She pushed it. It gave. Inside was the ground floor, one great round room, and a stone stair curving up the inside of the wall into the dark of the floors above. Flagstone under her boots, heavy timber across the ceiling. The light came slanting in through the deep window slits and lay across the floor in long pale blades. And along the curve of the north wall, the hearth. She had seen it in the photo. The photo had lied. Not the way Bess meant. The other way. It had made the thing smaller. It was a cooking hearth from before iron stoves existed, wide enough to walk straight into. An iron crane still bolted into the inner stone, a heavy lug pole spanning the opening at the height of her chest. The granite of it blackened by a century and a half of fire down to a depth of color that was almost metal. Above it, a mantle beam of old-growth pine, dark with smoke, wide as a church pew, and sound as the day it was set. And the throat of it climbed, up into that central chimney, up through 5 floors of stone toward the cap and the gallery and the open sky. It wasn't a fireplace. It was the bottom of the whole tower's spine. Whatever burned down here, the smoke of it rose all the way to the top. And anything that burned bright enough at the top, she stopped that thought where it stood, filed it, came back to the stone in front of her, the hearthstone. It lay in the floor directly before the firebox, a single slab of granite 4 feet across and 3 deep inches thick. The landing stone, the one that would have caught every spark and ember and drop coal of 140 years of daily fire. Sadie crossed to it, knelt, put her palm flat on it. Cold. She pressed down, felt the dense ancient refusal of granite that has not moved in a very long time. Then she ran her fingers along the edge. And the hearthstone did not meet the floor around it the way the other flags met each other. There was a gap, narrow, even, a 1/4 inch maybe, running the full length of 2 sides, not a crack, not a settling. A gap, deliberate. The kind you leave when you want a stone to sit without being mortared down. The kind you leave when you want a stone you can lift. Sadie pressed the far edge. Nothing. She pressed the near edge, the one closest to the fire, and the stone moved. Not much, less than 1/2 inch. But it rocked, the way a stone rocks when it's balanced on a point instead of bedded flat, the way a lid sits on a box that is meant to be opened. She sat back on her heels, and her heart was going hard now, too hard, and she made it slow down because a racing heart makes for sloppy hands, and whatever this was, whatever was waiting under there, it deserved careful hands. Not tonight. The light was almost gone. The bar she'd need was out there somewhere in the dark in the wreck of that collapsed shed she'd passed on the way in. Tomorrow. Tomorrow she'd find an iron bar long enough and a fulcrum to set it on, and she'd lift this stone and finally see what her grandmother had sent her all this way to find. Tonight she had a tower, and no heat, and a dead woman's voice in her head saying a place was waiting. So she did the only thing that made sense. She built a fire. She went out into the blue dusk and gathered dry wood from the ruin of the old shed, carried it in, knelt at the great hearth, and built the fire the way Cleo had taught her. Paper, then fine kindling, then bigger pieces, each one set to let the air move through, nothing crammed, nothing forced. She struck a match. It caught on the second try, and the old chimney drew. It drew like it had been waiting. A low, steady pull of air up the throat of the tower smoke, rising clean and certain through 5 floors of stone toward a sky it hadn't touched in decades. The flue was clear. The draft was true. Near 70 years cold, and the spine of that tower came alive on the second match like it had never once forgotten what it was for. The fire grew. Its light filled the bottom of the room with orange and pushed the shadows up the curving stair, and the granite slowly began to give the warmth back. Sadie sat on the flagstone with her back against the hearthstones and her grandmother's bag resting against her knee. And for the first time since she came down the stairs that morning and saw the suitcase by the door, she felt something that wasn't falling. It wasn't safe exactly. It was older than safe. It was the feeling of a load finding its footing, of weight sitting down at last on something built to hold it, a place that's waiting for you. Maybe Cleo had meant it plain. Maybe there was nothing under that stone but more stone. Maybe the granite matching the ring was only the sort of thing a tired girl tells herself at the end of the worst birthday of her life. But the fire was warm, and the tower held, and in the morning she would lift the stone. She was nearly asleep against the warm granite when she heard the tires. A car, not a truck, picking its slow, careful way up a lane that had not felt a vehicle in years. It stopped outside. Two doors, open, shut. Footsteps on the stone path. And Sandra Keel stepped through the open door of the tower like she'd booked the appointment. Still in the cream blazer, the low heels ruined now, one of them caked with mud, she kept glancing down at like it had personally betrayed her. A leather portfolio under one arm. And behind her a young man in a navy suit that fit too well for this side of the bay, carrying a briefcase wearing the careful, eager face of a lawyer hired recently enough that he was still trying to prove he was worth it. Sadie stood up from the fire. She didn't say a word. She just let the silence sit there and get heavy. Sadie, Sandra said. Nothing. I know how this looks. The warm voice, the buyer on the fence voice. But I'm here because I'm worried about you, and because you made a very big decision today without all the facts. What facts? Sandra opened the portfolio, drew out a page, held it across the firelight. There's a developer, Halford Coastal. They've been working with the county on parcels up here for a long while now, this one included. They were finishing their own transfer when you filed this morning and got in front of them. The listing was public. It was. Then I didn't take anything from anyone. I'm not arguing the law. Sandra set the page down on the great pine mantle, gently, like it was fragile, like it was a gift. I'm telling you, there are people with real money who want this rock, and they will make your life very, very hard if you try to hold on to it. Then they'll make it hard. And Sandra looked at her then with an expression Sadie had never quite seen on her aunt before. Recalibration. The look of a woman whose script had a line in it the other actor flatly refused to say. I can make this simple, Sandra said. You sign the tower over. They pay you $20,000 for the trouble. You take that money and you go start a real life somewhere that makes some kind of sense. Because this, a small wave of the hand at the round stone room, the fire, the dark stare, the girl, this is not a life for a 17-year-old with no money and nobody. Sadie looked at the page on the mantel. Then she looked at her aunt, and she asked the only question that mattered. Who told you I filed today? The fire popped. Nobody answered. I signed those papers this afternoon, Sadie said, quiet, even, with the county clerk, about 4 hours ago, 11 miles up a road past the end of the pavement. It's not in any system yet. Won't be till tomorrow at the earliest. She took one step toward her aunt. So how did a developer 3 hours south of here hear about it by tonight? And how did you? Sandra's face didn't move, but something behind it did, some small mechanism, turning. $20,000, the young lawyer said too quickly, lunging for the gap in the room with the only number anyone had handed him. That's a fair price for a property in this condition. Sadie turned and looked at him, and then she walked to the door and opened it the rest of the way and stood beside it with the cold coming in off the bay at her back and the fire at her front and the whole impossible tower rising into the dark above her head. Get out, she said. Both of you. Sadie, please. Sandra lifted the page back off the mantel, slid it into the portfolio, smoothed the blazer that did not need smoothing. The young lawyer fumbled his briefcase against his knee. Sandra stopped in the doorway. She did not turn around. You're 17, she said. No money, no lawyer, no idea what you've walked into. A breath. When you figure out you need help, you call me. Then she stepped out into the dark. The lawyer followed. Sadie listened to the heels on the stone, and then the doors, and then the engine, and then the tires backing carefully down a lane they never ever should have known to climb. She closed the oak door. The iron latch dropped into its keep with a sound that was small and final and very, very old. She went back to the fire, sat down, pulled her knees up. The hearthstone was right there in front of her, an arm's length away, its surface dark with the ash of a century and one fresh fire, and along its eastern edge, that thin, deliberate line. The seam someone had left on purpose for a stone they meant to be lifted. Somebody had tipped them off. Somebody who knew that very afternoon that a girl with a single dollar had signed 3 pages in a brick building 11 miles past the end of nowhere. Sadie put her right hand flat on the hearthstone. It was warm now, from the fire. She looked at the ring. The small oval stone caught the low orange light and held it glowing somewhere between the green of deep water and the gray of the sea on an overcast day and the cold silver of the bay outside. The same color as the walls, close enough that she'd known it the second she came through that door. Tomorrow she'd find a longer bar. Tomorrow she'd get her leverage. Tomorrow she'd lift the stone and see what her grandmother had pointed her toward from a hospital bed 4 years ago, with a whisper and a ring and not one word of explanation. Tonight she sat in a tower that was hers legally, completely for $1 and a signature, and she listened to the wind come off the water and lean its whole weight against 2 feet of granite that had stood since 1887 and meant to keep standing a good while yet. The wall did not move. The fire burned, and Sadie watched the hearthstone and waited for the light. She did not sleep much. The fire burned down to ash somewhere in the small hours, and the cold came in through the high slits and found her the way cold finds you in a stone building. Not all at once, gradually, patient, testing every gap until the inside of the tower matched the night outside. She pulled her grandmother's wool sweater out of the suitcase and put it on and sat with her back against the hearthstones because the hearthstones held their warmth longer than anything else in that round, dark room. And she watched the sky through the window slit go from black to deep blue to the pale gray that comes before a Maine sunrise. When there was light enough to work by, she got up. She found the iron bar where she'd left it. 2 feet. Not enough. She'd known it wasn't enough last night. She needed length. She needed a fulcrum she could set exactly at the lip of the stone. So she went out into the cold morning to find them. And the tower in the gray, honest light of dawn was a different animal than the tower in firelight or the tower in that long gold dusk. The light was flat. It flattered nothing. It showed her everything. It showed her the truth of the thing. 5 floors of granite, the walls plumb, still plumb after 140 winters. The mortar chalky and pale where it was oldest, darker in the patches where some careful hand had repointed it decades back. The slate roof good mostly except near the very top, near that ring of stone gallery, where a section had gone 6 feet of it, maybe the opening furred over with moss and a little colony of tufted grass that had moved in and made itself at home in the rot. Repairable. The separations at the cap, not the base is sound. She caught herself doing it, the automatic reading, the way her father read a job before he'd say a word about it, the way she still did even now, even here, even with her whole life folded into a suitcase against the south wall. The collapsed shed was more complete than it had looked at dusk. Most of the wall stone was still there, just spread out from the footprint by the slow failure of the roof. The timber had rotted. The stone was good. Stone is almost always good. That's rather the point of stone. And against the inside of the far wall she found it. A length of old iron fence rail, 4 feet, an inch through, still straight, heavy enough to be a proper pry bar and long enough finally to give her the leverage the short one couldn't. And under a fallen roof beam, a granite cobble the size of a thick book. A fulcrum. She carried both back inside. She set the cobble 6 inches from the near edge of the hearthstone. She wedged the rail into the seam at a low angle and laid it across the stone. She checked the angle, then checked it again. Because you do not rush old stonework. You never force it. You set your weight against it slow and steady, and you let the material decide what it's going to do. She leaned in. the hearthstone rose. It rose clean, pivoting on the cobble, the far edge lifting as the near edge dropped, and she controlled the whole arc of it with both hands on the rail, easing it up until the slab stood at 45 degrees and balanced there. Stable. And she looked down into what it had been hiding. Not earth, not more flag. A cavity. Stone-lined on all four sides. Flat granite slabs set vertical, making a chamber maybe 2 feet wide, 3 long, 18 inches deep. Bone dry. The lining had kept the wet out completely, or near enough for however many decades the stone had sat sealed over it. And inside, resting on a flat stone base, exactly where a careful person would have laid it, a bundle, wrapped in heavy oilcloth. The waxed canvas they used before plastic existed, dark with age, whole, tied with lengths of waxed cord, the knots tight and plain and deliberate. Sadie reached in with both hands and lifted it out. It was heavier than it had any right to be. She carried it to the plank table against the south wall, a farm table that had outlasted nearly everything else in the room because it sat clear of the roof leak and was built of wood thick enough to laugh at time, and she set the bundle down. Then she went back and eased the hearthstone home, controlled the whole descent, felt it settle into its seat with that same uncanny precision, the gap closing to a hair, the slab looking once again like every other stone in the floor. Hidden, the way it had been hidden for as long as anyone alive could remember. She turned to the bundle. The oilcloth was stiff, but it folded back without cracking. She worked the knots loose one at a time, careful of the cord because the cord felt like something a person had tied with her own hands, and Sadie did not want to be the one to break it. Inside the oilcloth, a second wrapping. Heavy cotton muslin ironed flat once a long time ago before it was folded around what it held. And inside the muslin, 3 things. The first was a tin box, hinged lid, the size of a thick book. Painted dark green once, though, most of the paint had flaked off across the decades. The hinges fought her then gave. Inside each piece, wrapped in its own square of wax paper, was jewelry. Not antique in the showroom sense, old in the family sense, made to be worn and kept not displayed. A pair of earrings set with small dark red stones, garnets, a thin gold chain with a little cross, and a ring, a single oval blue stone, the same cut, the same impossible sea color as the one on Sadie's own right hand, only larger, set in a heavier, older bezel. And a locket, gold, oval, engraved across the front with a pattern of small leaves. Sadie opened it with her thumbnail. 2 photographs, one on each side, printed on the thin cardstock they used in the middle of the last century. On the left, a man, 40 maybe, a broad, plain, steady face, a collared shirt and a jacket that was clearly his one good jacket. On the right, a woman, dark hair pulled back, a pale dress, her hands folded in her lap. The formal stillness of a photograph taken on a day that mattered. And on the woman's right hand, on her right index finger, a ring, oval stone, pale. Even in that small, faded image, Sadie could see it was the same color as the stone on her own hand. She set the locket down on the muslin, gently, and she picked up the second thing, a journal, leather-bound, smaller than her own notebook, the cover worn smooth at the corners by years of being held. A leather cord wrapped twice around it, tied to keep it shut. She unwound the cord. She opened to the first page. The hand was small, precise. The ink faded from black to a warm brown, the kind of fading that takes a great many years to happen. At the top, in slightly larger letters than the rest, Marguerite Quill. Graywick, Maine, spring 1949. Sadie pulled the bench out from under the table, and she sat down. And she read. Marguerite Quill had been a young woman in 1949, married to Eli Quill, who was the grandson of the man who built the tower. Asa Quill, the stonemason, the whole village had called a fool, the man who'd spent the back half of his life stacking granite into the sky on Gaunt Point so he could light a fire at the top of it and be seen from out on the water. The early entries were short, practical, the weather, the price of bait, what the kitchen garden gave, a crack in the chimney cap that Eli repointed with a mix she described so exactly that Sadie could have walked outside and mixed it herself, a note about a neighbor called Only Old Halford, who'd been poorly since the spring thaw. Sadie read slowly. Outside, the morning came up full and yellow, and the light through the wavy old window glass fell across the flagstones in long, warm bars. The tone changed in the autumn of 1950. Eli has had his notice. They are calling him up. We have talked it over every night for a week, and there is nothing left to say. He reports next month. I do not know how to write what I feel about it, so I will not try. The tower will have to keep me, and I will have to keep the tower, and we will manage somehow until he comes home. Korea. Sadie knew the word before the journal said it. She'd read enough to know what a draft notice in the autumn of 1950 meant for a young man on the coast of Maine. Knew where they sent them. Knew the cold of that war was the kind that got into the marrow and didn't come out. Eli shipped in November of 1950. Marguerite kept the tower alone through the winter. Took in sewing from the village. Sold eggs. Sold what the garden put up. The entries through 51 and 52 thinned to 2 and 3 lines, at a stretch the shorthand of a woman working too hard to write much, and writing anyway because the journal was the only thing in that round stone room that ever answered her back. And then in the spring of 1952, one line, Eli is dead. A telegram. Cold up there, they say, worse than they tell you. That is all they tell me. And below it, days later in a hand that had changed, pressed harder, held different. I have sat with this for 3 days. I am going to write down what I have so I do not lose the shape of it. Eli is gone. The tower is mine. I am young and I have no child and no family within 200 miles. I have the girl from down the road, and I have the tower that Eli's grandfather built so he could be seen. And that is what I have. Sadie stopped reading. She lifted her eyes from the page. The girl from down the road. She read it again. She set the journal flat and picked up the locket and opened it and looked at the two faces. The broad, steady man. The woman with the folded hands and the pale ring. And then she kept reading because she had to know who the girl was. The girl appeared again and again after 1952. Described with the easy brevity of someone you no longer have to explain because she is simply part of the weather of your life. The girl came by with bread. The girl helped me get the last of the garden in. The girl sat with me through the storm. We talked till past midnight. I do not know what I would do without her. And then 2 entries later, a name. Cleo Renshaw walked the whole lane in the rain just to sit with me. She would not let me be alone in it. Sadie's hand went still on the page. Cleo Renshaw. Her grandmother's name before she married, before she was Cleo Vance, before any of it had been Cleo Renshaw. Sadie knew this. It was on the old papers Cleo kept in a cedar box at the back of her closet. The box she'd shown Sadie exactly once when Sadie was 12, opening it slow and explaining where the family came from. Cleo Ann Renshaw, born 1936. Sadie did the arithmetic before she could stop herself. Born 36, which made her 16 in 1952, old enough to walk a lane in the rain, old enough to be the one person standing between a young widow and the kind of loneliness that swallows people whole. She sat with that for a long moment. The girl from down the road was her grandmother. Cleo had walked this lane, had sat on this floor, had built fires in this hearth maybe 16 years old, beside a woman whose husband had died of the cold in a country across the world. And 70 years later, Cleo had pressed a ring into Sadie's palm in a hospital room and said a place was waiting. It was not an accident. None of it was an accident. Sadie pressed the heels of both hands against her eyes, just for a second, just until the room held still. Then she picked the journal back up, because the next entry was where everything turned. 1954, a different kind of writing, slower, more careful. The hand of a woman choosing each word like she was setting stone. Something has happened that I do not fully understand and that I must write down carefully because I think it will matter one day. Old Halford died in the winter. I wrote of his illness 2 springs back. He was the last of the Halfords who actually lived in Greywick. The family has had lawyers up here for months sorting through the estate, and yesterday one of them came to see me. He had a document. He told me that Cyrus Halford amended his will not long before he died, that he added a provision no one had known about, that a parcel of 47 acres of coastal land, including the very ground the tower stands on which the Quills had been working under a long lease for 2 generations, was to pass in full and clear ownership to me, to Marguerite Quill, upon his death. The lawyer had a paper for me to sign acknowledging the transfer. The land is mine, 47 acres. I did not understand why. I am not certain I understand it now, but I think I begin to, and I cannot write it here. Not yet. Eli knew, I believe. He never said it outright, but I think he knew. And then below that, in the same careful hand, I have a land certificate now. 47 acres of this coast. I am going to put it somewhere safe. Sadie looked up. The third thing from the bundle was still sitting on the muslin beside the tin box. She'd registered it when she unwrapped everything, and then the journal had taken her whole attention. Now she set the journal down and picked it up. An envelope, sealed with red wax. The wax pressed with something round and plain, a thimble it looked like, not a proper seal, leaving a soft circular impression. And across the front, in Marguerite's hand, open when you need it most. Sadie turned it over in her fingers. She did not open it. Not yet. She set it down on the table square in front of her where she could see it. And she went back to the journal. The entries through 54 and 55 were the slow record of a woman managing too much land and one impossible tower entirely alone. A hard winter that pulled stone off the shed. Repairs made from the shed's own fallen rock. The price of fish. The years thinning her and the tower keeping her standing. Then 1956, a longer entry. I have been to Rockland to see a lawyer. Not the Halford man, a different one named Pell, who does property and probate, and came recommended by the minister here. I have told him about the certificate and about the tower and about what I want done with this place after I am gone. He has drawn up the papers. It is done now. Whatever happens to me, the tower will go where it ought to go. And then, in the summer of 1957, two lines that Sadie read 4 times. Cleo is leaving. She is to marry and go live inland. I am glad for her. She deserves everything good in this world. I gave her the ring from the tin box, the one with the pale stone. She will know what it means. Sadie looked at the ring on her own hand, the one with the pale stone. She set the journal down very gently. She flattened both palms on the table. She looked at the wall in front of her, and she breathed. Cleo had carried this ring for more than 60 years, from a tower on the Maine coast to a hospital room, from a young widow's tin box to a 13-year-old's palm. And then she'd pressed it into Sadie's hand and pointed her north without ever once saying north. Outside, a vehicle came down the lane. Not a car this time, something heavier, a truck moving slow over the rough ground. It stopped in the yard. A door. Boots on stone. A knock on the open door. Sadie turned. The man in the doorway was somewhere in his middle 70s, stocky, deliberate. Built the way men get built when their bodies have organized themselves around physical work over a great many decades. Canvas pants, a heavy flannel shirt despite the July warmth, boots resoled more than once, and his hands. Sadie saw them before she saw anything else about him because his hands told her everything. Wide at the knuckle, the skin rough, the nails cut short, an old mortar worked so deep into the lines of them that no amount of washing would ever get it all out. A mason's hands. He looked at the room. He looked at the hearthstone. He looked at the things spread across the table. Then he looked at her. Wendell Pike, he said. Heard somebody filed on the Folly. Yesterday, Sadie said. He nodded slow, like it confirmed something he'd been chewing on the whole drive out. That chimney's been cold a long time. He looked at the hearth. You lit it. Last night. You checked the flue first. I listened to the draft. It pulled clean. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not approval. The thing that lives next door to it. He came inside. He walked to the hearth and stood in front of it and looked up into the firebox, into the great granite throat of it, and he ran his hand along the lintel stone, feeling for the joint where it met the side jambs. This is the best piece of stonework in the county, he said. Maybe the state. Asa Quill cut every block of it out of the ledge under your feet. People called him a fool. A pause. People generally do when a man builds something they haven't got the patience to understand. He turned, looked at the hearthstone, at the eastern edge of it where the seam ran. Then he looked at her. You lifted it. Not a question. This morning. He nodded again. He pulled the bench out and sat down without being asked, the way a man sits in a building he's been walking into since before the current occupant was born. Hands on his knees. He looked at the table, the tin box, the locket, the journal. Then you know, he said. I'm learning. His eyes went to the journal, and his face shifted into something old and private. I knew of Marguerite Quill, he said. Barely. I was an infant when she left. But my father kept this lane clear 40 years, mowed the yard once a summer, kept the shed from going all the way to ruin, out of respect for her. He looked at the flames. He said she was the most capable woman he ever met, and the loneliest. She had a friend, Sadie said. Cleo Renshaw. Wendell Pike looked at her, sharp. Cleo Renshaw was my grandmother, Sadie said. Her name before she married. She lived in Graywick till 57. A long silence, the fire moving in the box. Wendell looked at her with a brand new kind of attention, and then his eyes dropped to her right hand, to the ring. Sadie held it up. Marguerite gave it to her. Wendell said, when she left. He wasn't asking. He knew. Yes. He was quiet a moment. Then your grandmother. She never told you about this place. She told me about Graywick, once or twice. She told me about granite, and how the coast changes the way you read the weather. Sadie's voice caught just slightly, and she let it. She told me this ring came from a place that was waiting for me. Wendell looked at the hearthstone for a long while. Then he looked at the table and everything on it, and then back at her in the unhurried way of a man who has learned to look at a thing properly before he says anything about it at all. All right, he said. What do you need? The roof, Sadie said. The section up by the gallery. If rain gets into that opening, it'll go straight down into the timber plate, and once the plate goes soft, the wall starts to lean. And a leaning wall on a 5-story tower is not a thing you fix. It's a thing you mourn. He nodded. I can get slate out of a salvage yard in Rockland. Match the thickness. Close enough on the age. Won't be identical. A pause. But it'll be right. What do you want for it? He shook his head. Once. My father watched over this tower 40 years for nothing but respect for a woman who was kind to him when nobody else up here was. I'll help you set it right for the same wage. They worked the rest of the morning. They went over the outside of the tower together, Wendell moving around the base with the systematic attention of a man reading a book he already knows by heart. His thumb testing the mortar joint by joint, stepping back at intervals to read the whole geometry of the thing against the sky. Sadie worked beside him, asking questions, listening to the answers, and inside the first half hour they both understood that they were speaking the same language. The walls were sound. The mortar wanted repointing in 3 sections on the north face, where the freeze-thaw had opened the joints wide enough to let water start its slow, patient work. The south and west were better sheltered by the lay of the point. The chimney cap up top had separated, but at the cap, not the base. Relayable. The roof was the priority, 6 feet of missing slate by the gallery. Move in the next 2 weeks before the next real rain, and they'd stop the rot before it reached the plate. And the whole time, Sadie kept catching herself looking up the curve of the tower, up past the window slits, up to the gallery and the slate cone, and the place where the chimney broke through into open sky. A fire at the bottom, smoke to the top, anything bright enough up there, seen from the water. She kept filing the thought, and it kept coming back. When Wendell left to arrange the salvage slate, Sadie went back inside and sat at the table and read the rest of the journal. The last entries were from 1957. Marguerite's hand unchanged from the start, still small, still careful, the hand of a woman who'd held on to her wits and her discipline right to the end. I have made my decision. I cannot keep the tower alone any longer. My hands are still good, but the work this place asks for is more than two hands can answer. The Halford Company has been sending letters. They want the land. They have always wanted the land. I will not sell it to them. Not for any price, not ever. And then I went to Rockland again to Pell. We have set everything in order. I am leaving what I have saved in the hearth cavity for whoever comes next. Whoever that is, they will find the journal and they will understand what the land is and what the papers mean and what to do. And the final entry, dated the 2nd of June, 1957, the last page before a few that had been folded over and tucked against the inside back cover. I am leaving today. I have put everything I mean to leave in the cavity beneath the hearthstone. The jewelry, the certificate, the letter. The journal goes in last. Whoever you are, you found this because you lifted the hearthstone, which means you are someone who pays attention to what sits underneath things. That is the right kind of person for this place. The hearth holds what the heart cannot carry. I hope it has kept it all safe for you. She had signed it simply Marguerite Quill, Graywick, Maine. And below the signature, a note added later, the ink a slightly different shade. I have sealed the last pages. Do not open them until you need to. You will know when. Sadie closed the journal, and she sat with her hand on the cover for a long moment in the round stone room where a 16-year-old girl, who would one day be her grandmother, had sat with a grieving widow and refused to let her be alone. Then she heard the next vehicle on the lane, and this one she recognized before it even stopped. A newer engine, smooth, expensive, the sound of money picking its way carefully over rough ground. Sandra Keel came through the door without knocking. She was not alone. The young lawyer was with her again, still in the Navy suit, and beside him a second man, older, with that particular brand of expensive casualness that belongs only to people who have a great deal of money and want very much to appear as though they never think about it. Khaki trousers, a field jacket cut by someone who knew what they were doing. And he carried nothing, no briefcase, no folder, nothing, which meant he was the man the other two carried things for. This is Pierce Halford, Sandra said, president of Halford Coastal. Sadie set the journal down on the table, quietly, beside the locket, beside the red wax envelope she still had not opened. Pierce Halford looked at the room the way a man looks at a thing he intends to price. The hearth, the walls, the stair. His gaze moved across the table and stopped just for a beat on the tin box in the journal. Miss Vance, he said. His voice was measured, pleasant, the voice of a man who has never once had to raise it. I'll be straight with you. This land has been a priority for my company for years. Your filing yesterday made things complicated. The listing was public. It was. A small pause. I'm not here to dispute your right to the rock as a legal matter. I'm here to offer you a resolution that works for everyone. The young lawyer opened his briefcase, produced a document, set it on the table beside the tin box. $50,000, Pierce Halford said, for a voluntary transfer of title. You keep whatever you found in here. You take $50,000 on top of it, and you walk away with more money than this tower could make a person in 10 years of trying. Sadie looked at the paper. She did not pick it up. She looked at the locket instead, and she picked that up, and she turned it over in her fingers. and on the back, engraved in small letters she hadn't noticed before she found it. CH&M, 1929. CH. She thought about the journal. Old Halford died in the winter. Cyrus Halford amended his will. A parcel of 47 acres to pass to me to Marguerite Quill upon his death. I begin to understand, and I cannot write it here. CH&M. Sadie looked up at Pierce Halford. Your company's been trying to buy this land for years, she said. That's correct. This land that Cyrus Halford signed over to Marguerite Quill in 1954. Something moved in Pierce Halford's face, the smallest tightening at the corners of the eyes, the look of a man who has just heard a name spoken aloud that his family has spent a lifetime keeping in a drawer. The history of the parcel is complicated, he said. I'm starting to think it is. The young lawyer leaned in. The offer is $50,000. That's well above the assessed value for a property in this state. Sadie looked at Sandra. In Sandra's face was the face of a woman who had spent a great deal to get to this moment and was now waiting very still to see whether any of it had worked. I need some time to think, Sadie said. Pierce Halford nodded. Of course. He set a card on the table. 24 hours. Then he turned and walked out the oak door, and the young lawyer went after him. Sandra stayed a moment. Sadie, she said, and the warmth was gone out of her voice now, sanded clean off it. Take the money. Whatever you think you've dug up out of that floor, whatever's in those papers, you are 17 years old. No lawyer, no money, no standing. And these people have relationships in this county that go back 100 years. A breath. Take the money. Go start your life. Sadie said nothing. Sandra left, and Sadie stood in the empty tower and listened to the engines back down the lane and fade into the ordinary sounds of the coast. The wind, the gulls, the far-off weight of the bay. Then she picked up the red wax envelope. The seal was whole. The little circle the thimble had pressed into it clean and unbroken, open when you need it most in Marguerite's careful hand. She thought about the journal. It is done now. Whatever happens to me, the tower will go where it ought to go. She thought about the tightening at the corners of Pierce Halford's eyes when she said the year out loud. She set the envelope back down. Not yet, because there were the sealed pages, the ones folded over against the inside back cover, the ones Marguerite said not to open until she knew. And Sadie was starting to know. She opened the journal to the back. The folded pages weren't held with wax. They were folded in on themselves 3 times and closed with a single strip of gum paper tape, the kind they used to seal envelopes in the 50s, brittle now with all the years. She worked it loose along one edge, slow, not tearing the paper underneath. The pages open. 4 of them, covered in Marguerite's hand. Dated the 3rd of March, 1956, a year before she left. I am writing these pages separately and sealing them here because what they hold is the kind of thing a person might need one day in a court of law. And I do not want it found and destroyed by someone who would rather it never existed. If you are reading this, you have read the rest. You know the shape of it already. These pages fill in what the journal leaves out. Sadie read. And outside the wavy old glass, the July light went long and gold across the water, and the tower stood up into the sky the way it had stood for 140 years. And down in the round stone room, a 17-year-old girl bent over 4 brittle pages and read the secret that a dead woman had hidden under a stone and trusted the right person to come and find. The fire had gone to coals. She did not get up to feed it. She read. What the sealed pages held was this. Cyrus Halford had been Marguerite Quill's father. Not her legal father. Not her acknowledged father. Not a name on any paper anywhere. But her father all the same. Her mother had been a woman named Lottie Sims, who'd kept house for the Halford family in the early years of the century and who'd left Graywick before Marguerite was born and raised her daughter alone in Rockland and never once put a father's name on a single document. Because there are kinds of silence a woman chooses to protect a child, and kinds she's forced into, and sometimes you cannot tell from the outside which is which. Cyrus Halford had known. Her whole life he had known. He had never said it out loud, never claimed her, never let his name anywhere near hers. But he had watched, from a distance. And when the Quill family needed a long lease on their land back in the 20s, it was Cyrus who quietly made certain the terms were kind. And when he amended his will in 1954, dying with the lawyers already circling the estate, he had finally done the one thing he had refused to do for 60 years. He gave his daughter the ground, 47 acres of coast, including the rock the tower stood on. Not in his name, not with one word of acknowledgement, just the transfer, clean documented, handled by a Rockland lawyer who was nobody's Halford man. And the family had never accepted it. They had spent decades fighting it, through every channel a wealthy family can buy. Arguing Cyrus wasn't of sound mind. Arguing the transfer was improper. Arguing the land reverted to the estate the day Marguerite walked off it without re-registering her ownership. None of it had worked, because the transfer was clean, the paper was clear, the land had been Marguerite's until the day she died alone inland in 1990. And when she died, it passed exactly as the will she'd filed with the county in 1956 said it should. The will Pell drew up, the will that left everything, the tower, the land, all of it, to whoever next legally owned Quill's Folly, and was the first to light a fire in its hearth. Sadie set the pages down flat on the table. She sat very still, because she'd lit a fire, the first night, before she knew a single thing about any of it. Cold and tired and 17, she'd built a small fire to keep from freezing in a stone room, and in doing it she had, without one clue what she was doing, met the exact condition a dying woman set down a lifetime ago. It was not an accident. She'd thought she'd understood that sentence before. She hadn't, not all the way down. She picked up the red wax envelope, and this time she broke the seal. Inside a single folded document, heavyweight legal paper, dated September of 1956, notarized, signed by Marguerite Quill, witnessed by two people whose names were printed under their own signatures. At the top, in formal type certificate of title, Senate County, Maine, parcel Graywick Coastal Tract, 47 acres, owner of record Marguerite Lottie Quill. And below the type in Marguerite's own hand, initialed and dated 1957, the land goes with the tower goes with the fire. Sadie read it twice. 47 acres of Maine coast. Pierce Halford had offered her $50,000. And she didn't know land prices. She was 17. She'd shown up 4 days ago with $204. But she knew enough, anyone knew enough to understand that 47 acres of coastline was not a $50,000 number. The figure that surfaced in her head wasn't precise, but it had more digits in it than the one on Halford's paper. Several more. She sat in the tower that had waited for her, and she looked at the certificate in the open locket and the ring on her hand, and she listened to the wind off the bay lean against the stone. And somewhere out on the lane she heard Wendell Pike's truck turning back in, coming back with the salvaged slate. She put the certificate into the red wax envelope. She set it in the tin box with the jewelry. She put the sealed pages back into the journal and set the journal beside the box. She needed a lawyer, not Sandra's, not Halford's, her own. She got the name from Bess Trundy. She walked back to the county office that afternoon while Wendell sorted the salvage slate by thickness and color, unhurried the work of a man who knows that good restoration moves at the pace the materials allow and not one bit faster. Bess looked up over her reading glasses. "I need a property lawyer," Sadie said. "Land work, somebody with no connection to Halford Coastal." Bess took off the glasses, set them on the desk, thought a moment. "Imogen Fry," she said. "Rockland, 30 years of property and probate in this county. No Halford in her." A pause. "I can tell you that for certain because they tried to hire her once. She said no." She wrote the name on a card. You think you've got something, Bess said, not quite a question. I think I've got the truth, Sadie said, written down and kept dry under a stone. Bess looked at her a long moment. Then go let somebody help you carry it, she said. Imogen Fry's office sat on the second floor of a brick building on Main Street, up a flight of wooden stairs, worn smooth by 30 years of clients climbing them with their troubles. The office was the organized kind of cluttered. Books floor to ceiling, files on every surface, a desk that was clearly the center of a great deal of work, and a big window looking out over the harbor, the lobster boats sitting on the cold, bright water. Imogen Fry was somewhere in her 60s, gray hair cut short, a face weathered not by the outdoors, but by paying close attention to hard things for a living. Reading glasses on a cord. She shook Sadie's hand with the directness of a woman who does not use manners as a way to keep her distance. She told her receptionist to hold the calls, and she listened for 45 minutes without once interrupting. Sadie laid it all out in the order she'd assembled it. The listing, the dollar, the hearthstone, the bundle, the journal and what it held, the sealed pages and what they revealed about Cyrus Halford and Lottie Sims, and the daughter no one ever claimed, the certificate, the will filed with the county in 1956, the visits from Sandra Keel and Pierce Halford, and the $50,000. She set the tin box on the desk, and the journal beside it, and the red wax envelope beside that. She didn't open any of them. She described the contents. She let Imogen decide whether she needed to see the originals. Imogen reached for the journal first. She read the main entries fast, the way a person reads who processes the written word for a living. When she hit the sealed pages, she slowed, read carefully, her face neutral and focused. Then she opened the envelope and read the certificate twice, checking the notarization and the date and the parcel description against each other. She set it down, took off her glasses, cleaned them on her shirt, put them back on. The will, she said, filed with the county in '56. That's the document. If your friend Pell filed it properly, and by the sound of this woman he did, it's sitting in the county probate archive right now. Probate records here are public and kept permanently. Has been waiting there nearly 70 years. A pause. Which means Halford Coastal either doesn't know about it, or knows, and has spent a very long time hoping nobody else would go looking. Which is more likely. The '54 transfer was clean. Any competent title search would have turned it up. So they knew the land went to Marguerite, and they knew she died without direct heirs. A pause. What they may have been counting on, no one ever satisfying, is the condition of the will. The fire. You lit it the first night. Yes. Anyone see you? Bess filed my paperwork the same afternoon. It's time-stamped. And Wendell Pike came out the next morning and saw the fire was lit. The ash in the box will show a fire inside the last few days. Imogen made a note, and Sandra Keel showed up that same night, she said, which means she knew you'd filed, before it hit any public system. So somebody at the county told her, that's a problem for her, not for you, but it's worth having on paper. She looked at the certificate again. 47 acres. Coastal, in Graywick. A long, careful quiet. The quiet of a woman who knows the answer and is deciding how to hand it over. Coastal land in this county runs 40 to 80,000 an acre. Some of this will be ledge and wetland, which brings it down. But even accounting for every deduction you are looking at, somewhere between $1.5 and $2.5 million at today's market. Sadie looked out the window, at the harbor, at the boats on the cold, bright water. Pierce Halford offered me $50,000, she said. Imogen made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Yes, she said. I imagine he did. They sat in it for a moment. So, Sadie said, what do I do? Imogen picked up her pen. First, I pull the will this afternoon. If it reads the way you've described, and I expect it does, we file to have it recognized and the transfer executed. It'll take weeks, but the outcome should not be in real doubt. Halford will get notice as a matter of procedure, And they'll object, they'll say the will's condition was never certified as met. But Bess saw the filing, Wendell saw the fire, the ash backs the timeline. That objection is going to be hard to sustain. And the paper my parents signed, the thing Sandra keeps holding over me. Imogen set the pen down. Tell me exactly what she said about it. Sadie told her, as close to word for word as she could, that her parents had signed an agreement naming Sadie as a party while she was a minor, that it created some obligation that could be turned against her. Imogen thought about it a long while. If such an agreement exists, and if it named you without your knowledge or consent while you were under 18, it is not enforceable against you. A minor cannot be bound by a contract she never signed and was never represented in. A pause. But, depending on the language, it may be a serious problem for your parents. They may have represented to Halford Coastal that they had authority over your interests, which they did not. What happens to them as a result of contracts they entered into on their own, that's a separate matter, and it'll involve other lawyers. I want to be clear with you. My job in this is you. Sadie nodded. One more thing. Imogen picked up the sealed pages again. Read the passage about Cyrus Halford and Lottie Sims and the daughter no one claimed. Set it back down. This, if it goes into the public record of the probate, it will be uncomfortable for the Halford family. Their name is most of their business in this county. I'm not in the habit of embarrassing people, but the history is part of what establishes the land transfer. It may not be possible to prove the one without telling the other. Then we tell it, Sadie said. Imogen looked at her over the glasses and nodded once. All right. She gathered the documents into a careful stack and stood. I'll call you when I've got the will in hand. A pause. Where are you staying? The tower. Imogen looked at her. The roof has a patch, Sadie said. It's holding. And Imogen Fry almost smiled. Imogen called 4 days later. Sadie was on the roof with Wendell when the phone rang. Both of them working the section up by the gallery from opposite sides, Wendell setting the salvage slate, Sadie bedding each piece in the lime mortar they'd mixed that morning by the proportions he'd given her that first evening. The work had found a rhythm inside the first hour. Set the slate, bed the edge, move to the next. The repetition wasn't tedious. It was the kind that builds understanding, every piece a little different, asking for a little adjustment in pressure and angle, teaching her to read the stone through her hands. And the higher they climbed, the more of the world opened up beneath them. The whole point, the whole bay, the whole gray reach of the open water going out and out until it met the sky. She climbed down the ladder to take the call. Imogen's voice was measured, but there was something under it that hadn't been there in the office. The quiet satisfaction careful people permit themselves only when they're certain. I have the will, she said. Filed March 1956. Witnessed and notarized. The language is exactly as you described it. A pause. And there's something else. Sadie waited. Pell, the lawyer who drafted it, died in '81, but his practice was absorbed by a firm in Rockland that still exists. They have his original client files. When I explained the situation, they pulled the Quill file. A pause. Marguerite came back to Pell in 1965, 8 years after she left Graywick. She was living inland by then. She updated the will with a codicil. What kind of codicil? It says that if the will's condition is met by a person who can show a direct personal connection to the property through a prior resident or owner, the transfer is to be accompanied by a second document. What document? A letter, Imogen said. Marguerite wrote a letter in 1965 and left it with Pell's firm, with instructions that it be delivered to whoever met the will's conditions. A pause. They've held it ever since. Sadie sat down on the granite step outside the tower door. They're sending it, Imogen said. Express, you'll have it tomorrow morning. She went on. The legal timeline. The probate application filed. Halford notified their lawyers in contact as expected, indicating they'd object. A preliminary hearing set for the following week in Rockland. She expected the objection to fail, but Sadie should be ready for it to take some weeks before the transfer was formally executed. "And Sandra," Sadie asked. A pause. "Her agreement with your parents has been reviewed," Imogen said. "She represented to Halford Coastal that she had authority to act for your interests based on your parents' written consent. Your parents signed a document granting it, and that document is a problem because they had no such authority over your future property to grant." A pause. "I expect Halford's lawyers are having a very uncomfortable conversation with Pierce Halford right now about exactly what they were told before they made a $50,000 offer to a minor." Sadie thought about the note on the suitcase. "We can't keep watching you throw your future away." "And my parents," she said. "They'll need their own lawyers." "They will. I can give you some names to pass along if you want." Sadie was quiet a moment. "Please," she said. She went back up the ladder and finished the section with Wendell. They worked in silence, the comfortable silence of two people doing the same work who've stopped needing words for it. By mid-afternoon, the gallery section was covered, the new slate bedded and sealed the line of the roof, restored to something close to what it had been 140 years ago. Wendell stood back on the ladder, looked at it a long moment. "Good," he said. "That's good work." It was the highest thing she'd heard him say. The letter came the next morning, a flat express envelope, the return address of the Rockland firm. Sadie carried it inside and sat at the table and held it a moment before she opened it. Because inside was whatever Marguerite Quill had written in 1965 and set down to wait all these years for a person who had not yet been born. She opened the outer envelope. Inside was a second, smaller, cream-colored, aged to a faint yellow at the edges. On the front and the hand, she now knew as well as her own, small, careful, unhurried, for whoever comes next. She opened it. 2 pages, the same heavyweight paper as the certificate, the same careful hand. Dated October of 1965. "I am writing this because I have been thinking about the tower for 8 years, and there is something I did not put in the journal. I did not put it there because when I wrote the journal, I did not know how to say it. I am older now. I have had more time with the things I do not know how to say, and I have found that the only way through them is to write them down plain. The first thing is this. I did not leave Greywick because I was giving up. I left because staying had become a way of refusing to let the tower be what it was always meant to be, which was a place that could shelter someone who needed it. It sheltered me for many years after Eli died. It was time for it to shelter someone else. I could not know who, so I set the conditions and I left the papers and I trusted the right person to come. The second thing is about the girl." Sadie held the letter a little more carefully. "Cleo Renshaw was the finest person I have known in my life. I do not say that lightly. She came to me the week after the telegram about Eli, and she sat with me in that tower for 3 days, and she did not leave except to go home and feed her animals and come straight back. She did not tell me it would be all right. She did not tell me time heals. She sat with me and she worked beside me, and she let me be exactly what I was, which was a woman whose husband had frozen to death in a country across the world and who did not know how to go on. That is the most valuable thing one person can do for another, to sit with them in the hard place without trying to move them out of it before they are ready. When Cleo left to marry, I gave her the ring with the pale stone. I gave it to her because I wanted her to carry something of this place. The stone is the same color as the granite of these walls. I wanted her to have that color with her wherever she went, so that whenever she looked down at her own hand, she would remember what it felt like to stand somewhere real and solid and made to last. I did not tell her about the cavity. I did not tell her about the papers. I did not tell her the terms of the will. I told her only that the tower would take care of itself, and that she must not worry about what she was leaving behind. But I told her to keep the ring, and I told her to give it one day to the person in her life who paid the most attention to what things are made of and how they hold together. I trusted her to know who that would be. If you are reading this, she found the right person. Sadie put her hand over her mouth. I do not know who you are. I do not know your name or where you came from or what brought you up that lane, but I know you are there because Cleo trusted you with the ring, and that is enough for me to know what kind of person you are. The tower has held everything safe for however many years it took you to come. It was built to last, and it has lasted. Now it belongs to you, not as a gift, as a recognition. It knew you when you came through the door. The hearth holds what the heart cannot carry. Now it carries something else. Take care of it. There was no signature. Just below the last line, a small addition in a slightly different pen, as though added on another day. P.S. The apple trees on the east slope. They are old, but they are Roxbury russets, a variety that has been in New England since before this country had a name. Do not pull them out. They will bear again if you are patient with them. Sadie set the letter down, and she sat with it a long time in the round stone room in the tower, where a young widow had once sat with her grief and her work, and her one friend who'd refused to rush her through it. The hearthstone was back in the floor in front of her, fitted clean like it had never moved. She thought about Cleo, 16 years old, walking the whole lane in the rain, just to sit. She thought about what it means to sit with someone in the hard place, without trying to move them. And she thought about the suitcase by the door in the house she grew up in, which had also been a hard place. Except the people who packed it had wanted her to move before she was ready, had built her a door out and called it love. That wasn't love. She knew that now. She'd known it standing on the porch in the gold light. But she knew it deeper now with the letter in her hands. Love was the girl who walked the lane in the rain and would not let a woman be alone in the worst of it. She folded the letter, placed it inside the journal beside the sealed pages, closed the journal, set it on the mantel above the hearth. Then she went out and walked up the east slope to look at the apple trees. They were there, exactly as Marguerite said, old and unpruned and wild-shaped, their branches reaching wherever years of nobody's attention had let them reach. But the bark was healthy, the structure sound beneath the wildness. And when she cut a small section from a low branch with her knife, the wood inside was clean and white and full of life. Roxbury russets. She'd need to learn the pruning. She'd need to be patient, like the letter said. But the trees were alive, and that was enough to start with. The preliminary hearing was on a Thursday morning. Sadie wore clean work clothes, the same canvas pants she wore on the roof, her grandmother's leather bag over one shoulder with a tin box in the journal inside. Imogen met her on the courthouse steps. The hearing room was smaller than Sadie had pictured. Wood-paneled, high ceiling, the smell of old paper, in the quiet of a place where serious things get decided calmly. The judge was a woman in her 50s, reading glasses, a face arranged into careful neutrality. At the other table, two lawyers from a Portland firm there for Halford Coastal, suits that whispered money instead of shouting it. Pierce Halford himself was not there. Sandra was not there either. Imogen had told her Sandra had retained her own counsel after the discovery that the contract she'd signed on Halford's behalf rested on an authority she never had. The Halford lawyers presented their objection. It was well built, delivered with the confidence of people who'd won this kind of argument before. They challenged the certification of the will's condition. No independent witness, they said, could verify that Sadie Vance had lit a fire in the tower's hearth inside the window the will required. They challenged the chain of title from the 1954 transfer. Cyrus Halford's mental capacity, they said, was never documented. They challenged the 1965 codicil, a document produced by a defunct practice, could not be authenticated. Each point made cleanly, without drama. Imogen answered each in turn. The county filing established Sadie's ownership as of the afternoon of her arrival. Time-stamped. The fire was lit that evening, documented by ash in the box, consistent with a fire inside 72 hours of Wendell Pike's arrival the next morning. Wendell would testify. The 1954 transfer had been reviewed and confirmed valid by two independent title examiners whose affidavits were in the filing. The capacity argument had been raised by the Halford family once before in 1956, reviewed by the county court at the time, and dismissed. That dismissal was a matter of public record, res judicata, and the 1965 codicil had been authenticated by the originating firm and by a document examiner whose credentials were in the filing. And then there was the matter Imogen said of how a developer 3 hours south had learned of a miner's filing the very night it was made before it entered any public system. She had a timeline. She had Bess Trundy. She would, if the court wished, establish exactly who at the county had passed that information along and to whom. And she would establish why a section of the north wall that a Halford crew had recently been permitted to inspect and shore had failed in a storm 3 nights ago, nearly killing a man, and shown on inspection every sign of having been deliberately weakened. The room went very still at that. The judge asked questions, clear ones, specific ones, the questions of a woman who'd read every filing carefully and wanted certain points nailed down. She asked about the condition of the hearth cavity and when it was opened. She asked about the chain of communication between the county and Sandra Keel on the day of filing. She asked about the storm and the wall and the man who was nearly killed. She asked about the assessed value of the parcel and the basis for the $50,000 offer. And when she had finished asking, she looked at both tables for a moment, and she said, "The objection is denied." No elaboration. The flat, decisive tone of a person stating a fact. The probate application will proceed. The will's conditions have been met as documented. A final order of transfer will issue within 30 days. She thanked both parties and left the room. The Halford lawyers gathered their files without a word. They left without looking at Sadie. Imogen shook her hand on the courthouse steps in the harbor light. "That's not the end," she said. "They could appeal. These things move slow." "I know. But the outcome's not in real doubt now. The documentation's too clean, and the rest of it, the wall, the tip-off, that's not just a property matter anymore. That's the kind of thing that makes a company decide it would rather be somewhere else." Pierce Halford did not appeal. Imogen called 2 weeks after the hearing with the news in her usual matter-of-fact tone. And 3 months later, Halford Coastal withdrew its acquisition applications for every remaining parcel in Graywick. The company issued no statement. The lawyers simply stopped filing. Sadie understood without needing it explained. The sealed pages, once they entered the public record, had done what Marguerite knew they might. The history of Cyrus Halford and Lottie Sims, and the daughter no one claimed, was a matter of county record now. And the storm and the wall, and the man nearly killed in it, those were a matter of record too. Pierce Halford had run the numbers. What further fighting would cost him? In legal fees, in scrutiny of his family's history, in scrutiny of a great deal more than that, and he decided the land was not worth it at that price. He wasn't wrong. It wasn't worth it at that price. It had never been worth it at any price. But that was a calculation he'd had to arrive at on his own. There was an accounting after. Sandra Keel lost her real estate license in the state. The licensing board found she had materially misrepresented her authority in a transaction, a violation they took seriously. Sadie's parents settled a civil claim from Halford Coastal, which argued it had been misled about the authority they'd granted when they signed Sandra's paper. The settlement cost them significantly. Sadie learned these things from Imogen in the same flat way lawyers convey what's relevant to a case without editorializing on it. And she did not feel satisfaction. She felt something quieter, a sense of proportion. The feeling you get when a wall comes out plumb. Not joy, just rightness. The sense that things had arranged themselves into a shape that was accurate, where what had happened to each person bore some fair relation to what they'd done. She called her parents once, in the fall, after the order was final and the immediate legal matters were settled. Her father answered. He was quiet a long while after she explained the situation. She did not lay out the legal consequences they were facing. That was not why she called. She called because Marguerite Quill had trusted a person she would never meet to carry something forward. And Cleo Renshaw had trusted a ring to find the right hands. And Bess Trundy had processed the paperwork carefully and honestly for a stranger who showed up with $1 and no plan. And Sadie could not square those facts with a life in which she never once picked up the phone and called the people who raised her. She told her father about the tower, the granite walls, the lime mortar, the hearth that was built in 1887 and still drew clean, about Wendell Pike teaching her to read the grain of old slate, about the apple trees on the east slope that had been bearing Roxbury russets since before either of them was born, about the garlic she'd planted that morning in the tern garden, pushing each clove down into dark soil that hadn't been worked in 70 years. Her father was quiet a long time. "You're doing the work," he finally said. "The actual work." "Yes." He was quiet again, and the silence was not empty. It was the silence of a man understanding something he'd been in the process of misunderstanding for a very long time. "Your grandmother would have understood all of this," he said. "I know," Sadie said. "I think she planned it." He didn't say anything to that, but she heard him breathe. The slow, careful breath of a person sitting with something large. Before she hung up, she gave him Imogen's name. For the matter with Sandra, that was all she could do. The rest was theirs to work through. She did not become wealthy. The numbers and appraisals are theoretical numbers. She met with Imogen and a land appraiser and a woman from a coastal conservation trust based down in Brunswick. And it was the conservation woman who turned out to matter most. The 47 acres held 14 acres of tidal wetland and rocky shore. Not buildable, not much good for farming, but it was the woman told her with the quiet excitement of someone who cares deeply about one specific thing, one of the last undeveloped coastal reaches of that size in the county. Nesting ground for three kinds of shorebird, a tidal creek that nursed juvenile striped bass, plant communities on the exposed ledge that hadn't been documented in that part of the coast. The trust would buy a permanent easement on those 14 acres, pay fair market value for the rights, restrict development there forever while leaving the ownership with Sadie. And the payment would be enough to fund the tower's restoration and cover her living for several years. She sold the easement. She kept the rest. The tower, the garden, the orchard, the fallen shed whose stone she was already planning to raise again, and a stretch of shore that wasn't part of the tidal habitat, but had a view of the bay she walked to every morning when the light was right. Not a fortune, a foundation, which was what she'd needed from the very beginning. And she did one more thing. Because the easement closed the conservation door against the developers for good, but it did not protect the tower itself. And the thing she'd learned in all of it was how easily a thing can be erased. A daughter unclaimed, a mother unnamed, a widow alone in a tower the whole village had decided was a fool's monument. So she filed to have Quill's Folly recognized as a historic structure, a surviving private day mark, one of a handful left on the whole coast. The kind of designation that means a thing cannot simply be called dangerous and pulled down. The kind that means a thing is at last on the record as worth keeping. And she put up a small plaque. By the door, cut from a piece of the ledge the stone Asa Quill himself had quarried. It named the tower, and the man who built it. And it named beneath that the two people the record had left out for 100 years. Marguerite Quill, who kept it, and her mother, Lottie Sims, who was never named on a single paper in her whole life, and who was named now, in stone, which is the one place a name does not fade, because that Sadie understood by then was the real inheritance, not the certificate, not the 47 acres, the understanding that things built to last will last, and that the people who build them, intend them, and trust them are part of what lasts. And that no one, no daughter, no mother, no woman alone in a stone room deserves to be left off the record of her own life. In November, when the days went short and the cold came off the bay with intention, Sadie climbed the inside stair of the tower for the last task of the year. 5 floors, past the window slits, past the rooms she hadn't begun to make use of yet, up to the cap, and out through a low stone door onto the gallery, the walkway in the sky, the granite railing running the whole way round the whole bay, spread out cold and silver below her, and the open water past it, going out and out to the edge of the world. And in the iron cradle at the center of the gallery, the cradle Asa Quill had forged in 1887, the cradle that had sat empty and cold for the better part of a century, she built a fire. Not for warmth, not for light in a room, a signal fire, the kind the whole tower had been built to carry, the kind a man stacked granite into the sky for so that a person out on the cold water alone in the dark might look up and see it and know which way the land was. She built it the way Wendell had shown her, the way Cleo had shown her long before that. Paper, kindling, then the hardwood. Nothing forced. She struck the match. It caught on the second try, and the fire climbed. And the wind off the bay took the light of it and threw it out across the water, out past the rocks, out past the point, out to wherever a boat might be late and cold and looking for the shore. For the first time in a lifetime, Quill's folly was lit. And it was not a folly. It had never been a folly. It had only been a thing the world hadn't had the patience to understand. A man's stubborn, granite-stacked insistence that he could be seen, that the people out in the dark deserved a light to steer by, that you build the thing that lasts and you light it, and you trust that someone someday will be out there to see it. Sadie stood on the gallery in the cold with the fire at her back and her grandmother's ring on her hand, the pale stone catching the firelight and holding it, the green of deep water, the gray of the overcast sea, the silver of the bay below, the same color as the walls. She thought about Marguerite riding in the round room with her husband dead, in the cold of a far country, and a 16-year-old girl beside her who would not let her be alone. About that girl half a century on, pressing a ring into a child's palm in a hospital room and saying words that were a direction dressed up as a mystery. About the hearth holding what had been left beneath it through freeze and thaw, in the slow advance of spruce and the complete indifference of everything beyond the property line. The hearth holds what the heart cannot carry. Some things are too heavy to carry through a whole life, with nowhere to set them down. Grief. The love of someone who is gone. The knowledge of what you owe the people who came before you and the ones who will come after. These things have to be set somewhere solid and trusted to wait. The hearth had held Marguerite's grief and her savings and her papers and her faith in a future she'd never see. Cleo had held the knowledge of this place in a ring and carried it half a century and pressed it into the right hands at the right moment. And Sadie had come up the lane with her calluses and her cracked phone and her grandmother's bag, and she had lifted the stone and found what was underneath. She was 17 years old. She owned a tower built in 1887 whose walls were still plumb and true. 47 acres of Maine coast, 14 of them protected forever. An orchard of apple trees older than anyone she'd ever known. A hearth that drew clean and a chimney rebuilt at the cap, and a signal fire burning on the gallery again at last. She had a mentor who'd teach her to raise a fallen shed from its own stone, and who understood that good work is done at the pace the materials allow. A lawyer who returned her calls. A county clerk who'd handed her a name when she needed one. She had work to do, real work, the kind that leaves marks on your hands and changes the shape of what it touches. The shed in the spring, the garden coming up in April, the trees that needed years of careful pruning to bring back, the north wall to check in 5 years, the chimney cap to inspect every winter before the cold came in. A tower like this is not a thing you maintain. It's a thing you tend, continuously, with the understanding that the work will never end, and that this is not a burden, it's a definition. A place that asks for tending tells you who you are. Sadie had needed for a long time something to tell her that. She knew now. She looked out over the bay. The fire threw its light across the dark water, and somewhere out there maybe a boat saw it. And maybe whoever was aboard looked up at that impossible granite tower with a flame burning at its crown and felt the thing you feel when you are cold and far from shore, and you see against all reason a light, which is that you are not as alone as you thought, which is the whole reason a person builds a thing like this in the first place. The wind came off the water and moved through the spruce that had been advancing on the point for 70 years. The same spruce she'd cut back in the spring to let the morning light onto the east slope, to give the old apple trees the room they needed to go on doing what they'd been doing for longer than this country had been a country, which was to grow and bear and last. The fire burned on the gallery, the granite held, and the tower that a fool had built so that the lost might be seen stood lit on the dark coast, and was seen.